crucial as his conclusion at this juncture that I think we ought to underscore it. Page 201. No, it's not in this 201, I beg your pardon. He talks about evidence there, but I don't think he makes this point there. Okay, take that back. The point that he makes is this. You should proportion your assent to the evidence. You should always proportion your assent to the evidence. Now, the first time I came across that, I sort of nodded in assent as if I had enough evidence for that assertion. Because I think that we are conditioned in a scientific age to proportioning our assent, at least the scientific beliefs, proportioning our assent to the evidence. But then I was struck when I heard a philosopher make this comment. Where is the evidence for that criterion of assent? Why should I believe Locke when he says I should proportion my assent to the evidence, when he tells me that with insufficient evidence? You see, and I think that self-referentiality argument, as it's called, self-reference, the criterion applied to itself, that self-referentiality argument, I think, is very telling, particularly in the light of this question: is belief voluntary? Now, you notice that Locke has told us that we voluntarily compound ideas. We put together simple ideas voluntarily into compound ideas. But by the same way, he is saying that assent to any proposition you see, and knowledge and belief have to do with propositions that, as you know, have both subject and predicate. You know, propositional outlines consist of propositions which predicate something, assert something, or deny something. Truth or falsity is a quality of propositions that we believe, or know, or think. So, propositions, beliefs. But we assent to a proposition. We deny a proposition. Well, says Locke, we should only assent to a proposition in proportion to the evidence. There are degrees of assent. He is assuming that assent is always voluntary and you can sort of mete it out bit by bit as the evidence accrues. I wonder, how did you come to believe in the existence of material bodies? When did you give your assent to the proposition that material bodies exist? You know, if this were a second day of an introduction to philosophy course, you'd think me crazy asking that question. You've always believed in the existence of material bodies, haven't you? As long as you can remember. You just grew up believing it. You couldn't imagine what it would be like not to believe it. You know, that's why trying to sell introductory students on Berkeley's idealism is such a headache. Yes, sir. Yeah. No, I'm not sure that beliefs are always voluntary. You see, and there's another tradition which develops, represented by Scottish realism, that we'll be talking about after Hume, a tradition that speaks of the fact that we are so constituted that certain beliefs arise spontaneously, naturally. Nowadays, philosophers are talking of belief-forming mechanisms which are at work in the human psyche. Belief-forming mechanisms. And the way Thomas Reid put it in the 18th century was that some of the things which Descartes doubted, those doubts are not the sort of things that philosophers can deal with. I mean, they need other kinds of specialists to deal with people who doubt those things. There's something wrong. Their belief-forming mechanisms aren't functioning aright. They need some psychological help, not philosophical help. Well, it's interesting, you see. And it really marks the watershed between two basic approaches to the whole question of the justification of belief. The evidentialist approach, represented by John Locke, you see, and the, what do you want to call it, basic belief, natural belief approach, represented by the Scottish realists. And this is one of the crucial epistemological issues today in the late 20th century. It's a large part of the epistemological debate is all about. And of course it applies to apologetics. Locke's influence was such that Christian apologetics in Britain during the 18th century was working on amassing evidence that would increase the probabilities. And that probabilistic approach characterized Anglican approaches to apologetics way through into the 20th century. The classic example in the 18th century was Joseph Butler's book, The Analogy of Religion, in which he used analogical arguments from phenomena in nature to the structure of things religious, in arguing for the truth of things religious by analogy from the truth of things in nature. You see. But it's sort of a probabilistic approach. The other view, the belief is spontaneous, has become more characteristic of the Reformed tradition. Scottish realists were Presbyterians of a sort. But in what is currently called Reformed epistemology, that being developed by Alvin Plantinga, people like that, you get this this notion of a naturally developing belief and the discussion of belief-forming mechanisms and so forth. So that if somebody says to Plantinga, well, I just don't believe in the existence of material bodies, his response is, what's wrong with you? You see. And in his Gifford Lectures in Scotland a few years ago that he's putting into print now, you know, he does the same thing with regards to the existence of God. You don't believe in the existence of God? What's wrong with your belief-forming mechanisms? You see, and for a Reformed theologian who thinks that our belief-forming mechanisms, like everything else, are affected by our condition in sin or grace, that's a loaded question. What's wrong with your belief-forming mechanisms? Well, this consciously in the contemporary debate goes back to John Locke. The person who raised the question in my hearing about the evidence for Locke's insistence on evidence was Nicholas Walterstorff, who's one of the people in this development of belief-forming mechanism theory. Okay, that means that next time ethics and social philosophy, but before we get to that, I'll want to say something about reason and revelation in John Locke's thinking. Okay, that'll wrap up the knowledge and belief section.